When my daughter said there was no seat for me at her wedding, I thought she was joking. But when the truth sank in, I realized everything between us was about to change. That single moment would set us on a path I never expected, one that would test our bond in ways neither of us could have imagined. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. For the past 20 years since my wife died, I've dedicated my entire life to making sure my daughter Sarah had everything she could ever want or need. I worked double shifts at the factory. I sold my classic Mustang that I had restored with my own hands, and I even gave up dating completely because Sarah told me it made her uncomfortable when I tried to move on after her mother's death. Every sacrifice I made was for her. Every dollar I earned went toward her education, her dreams, her future. When she graduated from college, debt-free thanks to the $180,000 I invested in her education, I felt proud that I had given her what my parents never could give me. When she moved into her expensive apartment downtown and needed help with rent, I didn't hesitate to send her money every month. When her car broke down and she needed something reliable, I co-signed for a brand new Honda and made the payments myself. When she met Derek 3 years ago, I welcomed him with open arms, even though something about his entitled attitude rubbed me the wrong way. He had that smug smile, and the way he looked at me like I was just some simple factory worker who didn't understand the finer things in life. But Sarah seemed happy, and her happiness was all that mattered to me. When Derek proposed with a $45,000 engagement ring that I later discovered he had charged to my credit card without asking, I should have seen the red flags. But I loved my daughter, and I wanted her to have the fairy tale wedding she had dreamed about since she was a little girl. I had been funding their wedding planning for months, writing check after check for deposits on venues, caterers, photographers, and everything else that goes into a perfect wedding day. The total was already approaching $70,000, money that came directly from my retirement savings, but I told myself it was worth it to see Sarah happy. So when she called me that evening, I expected her to tell me about some last-minute wedding detail or maybe ask for help with something else. Instead, her voice was cold and businesslike when she said the words that would shatter my world. "Dad, I need to talk to you about the wedding seating arrangements. Derek's family is much larger than we anticipated, and we've had to make some difficult decisions. There just isn't going to be room for you at the ceremony." The phone nearly slipped from my hands as her words sank in. I sat in my empty living room, surrounded by photos of Sarah throughout the years. Pictures of her graduation, her birthdays, family vacations we had taken together filled the walls, and I couldn't process what I was hearing. "What do you mean there's no room for me, sweetheart? I'm your father." Her sigh came through the phone like a cold wind. "I know this is disappointing, but you have to understand that Derek's family has very specific expectations about this wedding. His parents have invited their entire social circle, and we simply can't accommodate everyone. You'll understand someday when you're older and wiser about these things." The casual cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow, but what came next was even worse. After hanging up the phone, I sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My own daughter, the little girl I'd raised alone after cancer took her mother, had just told me I wasn't welcome at the most important day of her life. I walked to my home office and pulled out the folder where I kept all the wedding-related paperwork, spreading the receipts and contracts across my desk like evidence of a crime I was only beginning to understand. Venue deposit, $25,000, paid from my retirement account. Catering deposit, $15,000, charged to my credit card. Wedding dress, $8,000, another withdrawal from my savings. Photography package, $12,000. The numbers swirled in front of my eyes as I added them up, realizing that I'd already spent over $70,000 on a wedding where I apparently wasn't even invited to attend. Each receipt represented hours of overtime work, weekends spent fixing neighbors' cars for extra cash, meals skipped to save money, all so that Sarah could have her perfect day. I remembered the conversation we'd had just 6 months ago when she'd shown me the wedding venue, a historic mansion with sprawling gardens and crystal chandeliers. She'd been so excited, spinning around in the ballroom like she was still the little girl who used to dance on my feet while I hummed her favorite songs. "Daddy, this is exactly what Mom would have wanted for me," she'd said, tears in her eyes. She always said she wanted me to feel like a princess on my wedding day. Those words had sealed the deal for me. I'd signed the contract that very day, not caring that it would wipe out a significant portion of my retirement savings. If this was what would make Sarah happy, if this was what would honor my late wife's memory, then no price was too high. But now, sitting in my quiet house with these receipts spread before me, I began to see a different picture emerging. I pulled out my bank statements and credit card bills, going back 3 years to when Derek had entered our lives. The pattern was unmistakable once I started looking for it. Sarah's rent, paid by automatic transfer from my checking account. Sarah's car payment, charged to my credit card. Sarah's health insurance. I was still covering her as a dependent. Sarah's car insurance, paid quarterly from my savings account. Her credit card bills, her student loan payments that she'd somehow convinced me to take over, even her gym membership and Netflix subscription. I'd been funding her entire lifestyle without really thinking about it, treating it as natural as breathing. When had my generous support turned into complete financial dependence? When had my loving daughter become someone who expected me to pay for everything while giving me nothing in return except demands for more? I thought about the last time Sarah had called me just to see how I was doing, not because she needed money or help with something. I couldn't remember when that might have been. Our conversations had become purely transactional, with her reaching out only when she needed something and ending the calls as quickly as possible once she'd gotten what she wanted. I remembered my wife's words from all those years ago when Sarah was just a teenager. "Robert, you need to be careful not to spoil her too much. Love means teaching her to be independent and grateful, not just giving her everything she asks for." I'd thought I was being a good father, but maybe I'd been enabling something much darker. The wedding venue contract was in my name because I was the one with the credit and the financial stability to guarantee payment. The catering contract, the florist, the band, even the limousine service, all of it was under my name and my financial responsibility. Derek didn't have steady employment, something I'd learned recently, and apparently his family's wealth was more about appearances than actual liquid assets available for wedding expenses. I was the one making this elaborate wedding possible, and yet somehow I was also the one person who wouldn't be allowed to witness it. The irony was so bitter, I could taste it. The next morning, I decided to drive over to Sarah's apartment to have a face-to-face conversation about the wedding situation. Maybe there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe we could work something out, like moving me to a different table or having a smaller ceremony with a larger reception. I still couldn't believe that my daughter would really exclude me from her wedding day, not after everything we'd been through together. Not after all the sacrifices I'd made to get her to this point in her life. I parked across the street from her building and was about to cross when I heard familiar voices coming from her open balcony window. Sarah and Derek were having what sounded like a heated discussion about wedding plans, and something in their tone made me pause and listen instead of announcing my presence. "I still think we should have just eloped," Derek was saying, his voice carrying that whiny quality that always irritated me. This whole production is getting out of hand, and dealing with your father's expectations is becoming a real problem." Sarah's laugh was sharp and cold, nothing like the warm sound I remembered from her childhood. "Trust me, cutting him out of the guest list was the best decision we could have made. Can you imagine how embarrassing it would be to have him there, telling all your family's friends about his little factory job and his simple life? Your mother would die of mortification." My blood ran cold as I heard my daughter, my own flesh and blood, talking about me like I was some shameful secret she needed to hide. Derek's response was even worse. "The man is pathetic, honestly. A 68-year-old widower who's so desperate for purpose that he lives his entire life through his daughter's achievements. It's actually sad how he throws money at every problem, thinking that's what love looks like." Their cruel laughter drifted down from the balcony, each sound like a knife twisting in my chest. This was how they really saw me. Not as a loving father who'd sacrificed everything for his child's happiness, but as an embarrassment to be managed and manipulated. "At least after we're married, we can start setting some real boundaries," Sarah continued. "I'm thinking we should move to Derek's new job location and put some serious distance between us and all his neediness. Maybe then he'll finally get a life of his own and stop being so clingy and dependent on our relationship." The casual cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. After 20 years of putting her needs before my own, after working overtime and double shifts to pay for her education and lifestyle, after turning down dating opportunities and social activities because she said she needed me to focus on being her father, she was calling me needy and clingy. Derek chimed in with his own observations. "Plus, once we're established in our new city, we won't have to deal with his constant financial oversight. I appreciate that he's been funding our lifestyle, but his expectations about being involved in every decision are getting ridiculous. It's like he thinks paying for things gives him the right to have opinions about our choices." I pressed myself against the side of the building, hardly able to believe what I was hearing. They weren't just ungrateful for my support, they actively resented me for providing it while simultaneously depending on it completely. Sarah's voice took on a mocking tone as she imitated me. "Oh, Sarah, are you sure this venue is the right choice? Oh, Sarah, don't you think this catering package is a little extravagant? Oh, Sarah, maybe Derek should contribute something to these expenses." She laughed again, that cold sound that bore no resemblance to the daughter I'd raised. "As if Derek should have to pay for anything when Daddy's wallet is wide open and ready to fund whatever we want." The contempt in her voice was unmistakable, and I realized that somewhere along the way, my generosity had transformed from an expression of love into a source of resentment and entitlement. They saw me not as a father making sacrifices out of love, but as a fool being taken advantage of, someone whose feelings and dignity didn't matter as long as the checks kept coming. Standing there listening to their cruel words, memories flooded back with painful clarity, showing me a pattern I'd been too blind or too loving to recognize before. I remembered when Sarah was 15 and wanted to go on a school trip to Europe that cost $8,000. I'd worked 16-hour days for 3 months straight, taking every overtime shift available and even picking up weekend work cleaning offices to afford sending her on that trip. When she came back, instead of gratitude, she complained that some of her classmates had gotten to stay in nicer hotels and that I should have paid for the premium package. I'd felt guilty for not providing enough, never recognizing that her response showed a fundamental lack of appreciation for the sacrifice I'd made. When she was 17 and decided she absolutely had to have a car for her senior year, I sold my beloved 1967 Mustang that I'd been restoring for 15 years. That car was my pride and joy, a connection to happier times when my wife was alive and we'd worked on it together in our garage. Sarah had rolled her eyes when I'd gotten emotional about parting with it, telling me I was being overly dramatic about just an old car and that I should be happy to help her become more independent. She'd never once acknowledged what that car meant to me or thanked me for the sacrifice I'd made to buy her a reliable vehicle. When she graduated high school as valedictorian, I was so proud that I threw her a graduation party that cost me $3,000, inviting all her friends and their families to celebrate her achievement. During her speech that night, she thanked her teachers, her guidance counselor, even some of her classmates, but never mentioned me or the countless hours I'd spent helping her with homework, driving her to extracurricular activities, or the financial sacrifices that had made her success possible. I'd told myself she was just nervous and had forgotten, but looking back now, I could see it was part of a pattern where my contributions were simply expected and therefore invisible to her. College was a 4-year exercise in escalating demands and diminishing gratitude. The $180,000 I'd spent on her education came from refinancing my house, cashing out my life insurance policy, and working every available overtime hour for 4 years straight. I'd eaten ramen noodles and generic brand everything so that she could attend her dream school and graduate debt-free. Instead of appreciating this incredible gift, she'd complained constantly about not having enough spending money, not being able to afford the spring break trips her friends took, and having to work a part-time job like some kind of hardship case. She'd made me feel guilty for not providing even more, never acknowledging that most of her friends were graduating with crushing student loan debt while she walked away completely free and clear. After college, when she'd moved into an expensive downtown apartment that cost more per month than my mortgage payment, I'd helped with the security deposit and first month's rent as a graduation present. That temporary help had somehow transformed into a permanent expectation, with her calling me every month when rent was due, always with some story about unexpected expenses or temporary cash flow problems. I'd been making her rent payments for 3 years now, and she'd never once expressed gratitude or mentioned any plan to become financially independent. The car situation followed the same pattern. What started as co-signing for a loan had become me making the monthly payments when she'd claimed her new job didn't pay enough to cover both rent and car expenses. Her insurance, her maintenance, even her gas money often came from my wallet, but she'd never treated any of it as a gift or favor. It was simply expected, like the sun rising or gravity pulling things downward. Every birthday, every Christmas, every achievement in her life had become an opportunity for me to prove my love through increasingly expensive gestures. The gifts I gave were never quite enough, always lacking in some way that showed I didn't really understand her or care about what she truly wanted. But my failures were always accompanied by gentle suggestions about how I could do better next time, how I could show more thoughtfulness or spend a little more to really demonstrate my affection. After the devastating conversation I'd overheard, I knew I needed to understand exactly who Derek really was and what his true intentions might be regarding my daughter and my family. I'd always prided myself on being trusting and giving people the benefit of the doubt, but something about Derek had never sat right with me, and now I realized I should have listened to those instincts much sooner. I decided to do something I'd never done before in my life: hire a private investigator to look into Derek's background and current situation. It felt like a betrayal of trust at first. But then I remembered the cruel laughter I'd heard from that balcony and realized that trust was something that needed to flow both ways in a relationship. Margaret Foster, my longtime attorney who'd handled my wife's estate and various legal matters over the years, referred me to a discreet investigator named James Walsh, who specialized in background checks and financial investigations. Within a week, James had compiled a report that painted a picture of Derek that was far different from the successful young professional he pretended to be. Derek's family did indeed have money, old money from a grandfather's textile business, but Derek himself had been essentially cut off from the family fortune 2 years ago after a series of failed business ventures and what his father called irresponsible financial decisions. His trust fund had been suspended indefinitely, and he was currently living on a small monthly allowance that barely covered his basic expenses in the lifestyle he was accustomed to maintaining. The job Derek claimed to have in financial consulting was actually a part-time contract position that paid a fraction of what he'd led Sarah to believe, and even that position was in jeopardy due to complaints about his work performance and reliability. Most shocking of all, Derek had been secretly interviewing for positions in other cities, specifically looking for opportunities that would take him far away from our area. He'd already accepted a job offer in Seattle, Washington, with a start date just 3 weeks after the planned wedding date. He hadn't mentioned any of this to Sarah, and based on the investigators' findings, it appeared that Derek's plan was to surprise her with this exciting opportunity after they were married, essentially forcing her to choose between him and any connection she had to our area, particularly her relationship with me. The investigator had also uncovered Derek's financial records, which revealed a troubling pattern of credit card debt and unpaid bills. Derek owed over $40,000 to various creditors, had 3 credit cards that were maxed out and in collections, and had been borrowing money from friends and acquaintances for months to maintain his lifestyle. The expensive dinners, designer clothes, and luxury car lease that had impressed Sarah were all financed through debt and money he didn't actually have. Most disturbing of all, the investigator had discovered that Derek had been using my credit card information to make unauthorized purchases for months. The engagement ring I'd thought was an extravagant but romantic gesture had actually been purchased with my own money, without my knowledge or consent. Derek had somehow obtained my credit card information, likely from Sarah, who had access to it for emergency purposes, and had been making charges that he'd managed to hide among the legitimate wedding expenses I'd been paying for. Additional charges included expensive dinners, designer clothing, even a weekend trip to Las Vegas that he'd taken with his friends while telling Sarah he was attending a work conference. The total of unauthorized charges was approaching $15,000. Money that had been stolen from my accounts through identity theft and fraud. When I confronted James about how Derek might have gained access to my financial information, the answer was painfully obvious. Sarah had my credit card information for emergencies and legitimate expenses, and she'd obviously shared that information with Derek, either knowingly or through careless handling of sensitive documents in their shared living space. Either way, it represented a fundamental betrayal of trust that went far beyond simple ingratitude or entitlement. The investigator also revealed that Derek's family, despite their wealth and social status, had serious reservations about his relationship with Sarah. His parents considered her to be beneath their social class and had been pressuring Derek to break up with her for over a year. The wedding was Derek's attempt to present his parents with a fait accompli, hoping that once he was married, they would accept Sarah and restore his access to the family money. If that plan failed, Derek's backup strategy was apparently to move across the country and start fresh, using Sarah's emotional and financial dependence on him to ensure her cooperation with his plans. The next morning, I called Margaret Foster's office and arranged for an emergency consultation to discuss the legal implications of everything I'd discovered about Derek's fraudulent activities and the wedding situation. Margaret had been my attorney for over 15 years, handling everything from my wife's will to various business contracts, and I trusted her judgment completely. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her early 60s who had built her practice on helping ordinary people navigate complex legal situations with dignity and effectiveness. When I arrived at her office, Margaret could see immediately that something serious had happened. I'd brought copies of all my credit card statements, bank records, and the investigator's report, and I spread them across her conference table like evidence in a criminal case. As I explained the situation, from the wedding exclusion to the overheard conversation to the financial fraud, Margaret's expression grew increasingly serious, and she began taking detailed notes about potential legal violations and civil remedies. "Robert, what Derek has done constitutes identity theft and credit card fraud, both serious crimes that could result in criminal charges and significant prison time," Margaret explained as she reviewed the unauthorized charges on my credit card statements. "The fact that he's been systematically using your financial information for personal expenses, including that engagement ring, creates a clear pattern of criminal behavior that prosecutors would be very interested in pursuing." She continued her analysis, pointing out that the total amount of fraudulent charges, nearly $15,000, elevated the crimes from misdemeanors to felonies under state law. Additionally, the fact that he obtained your financial information through Sarah, whether she was knowingly complicit or simply careless with your sensitive data, could potentially make her an accessory to these crimes, though we'd need to establish her level of awareness and involvement. Margaret then addressed the wedding contracts and financial obligations, an area where the legal situation was more complex but still strongly favorable to my position. "Since you're the signatory on all these vendor contracts and the primary financial guarantor for the wedding expenses, you have significant legal rights and powers that Derek and Sarah may not fully understand. Most of these contracts include clauses that allow the paying party to modify or cancel services under certain circumstances, especially in cases where fraud or misrepresentation are involved." She pulled out several of the wedding vendor contracts I'd signed and highlighted specific language that protected my interests. The venue contract, for example, includes a provision that allows you to cancel or modify the event with appropriate notice, and since you're the one who's been making all the payments, the venue's primary obligation is to you, not to Derek and Sarah. The same applies to the caterer, florist, photographer, and other service providers. Margaret's analysis revealed that I had far more legal leverage than I'd initially realized. From a civil law perspective, Derek owes you restitution for the fraudulent charges, plus interest and potentially punitive damages for the intentional nature of his actions. You could also pursue a civil lawsuit for conversion, which is essentially the legal term for someone taking and using your property without permission. She recommended that we immediately file a police report for the credit card fraud, both to create an official record of Derek's criminal activity and to begin the process of recovering the stolen funds. The credit card companies will need a police report to process fraud claims and reverse the unauthorized charges, and having official documentation of Derek's criminal behavior will strengthen our position in any future legal proceedings. Margaret also suggested that we send formal legal notices to Derek demanding immediate restitution for the fraudulent charges and warning him about further use of my financial information. Sometimes the threat of criminal prosecution is enough to motivate people to make things right voluntarily, though given what you've told me about Derek's character and financial situation, I'm not optimistic that he'll be cooperative. Finally, Margaret addressed the question I'd been hesitant to ask. What were my legal rights regarding the wedding itself? "Robert, since you've paid for essentially everything and all the contracts are in your name, You have the legal authority to cancel or modify the wedding arrangements as you see fit. The vendor's primary obligation is to you as the paying party, not to Derek and Sarah as the beneficiaries of the services. If you decide you no longer want to fund this wedding, especially given the fraudulent circumstances and their treatment of you, you have every legal right to withdraw your financial support and cancel these contracts. That evening, my sister Helen called me from Arizona, where she'd been living since her retirement 5 years ago. Helen was 2 years older than me, and after our parents died, she'd become the family matriarch, the one who kept everyone connected and called people out when they were making mistakes. She'd always been direct and honest, sometimes brutally so. But her insights were usually spot on, and I'd learned to value her perspective even when it was difficult to hear. She'd been planning to fly in for Sarah's wedding, and when I told her about recent developments, her response was immediate and unequivocal. "Robert, I've been watching this situation develop for years, and I've been waiting for you to finally see what everyone else has been seeing about Sarah and that boyfriend of hers. I didn't want to say anything before because I knew you weren't ready to hear it, but Derek is a manipulative fraud, and Sarah has become a spoiled, entitled young woman who takes your generosity for granted." Helen's words stung because they confirmed what I'd been trying not to acknowledge about my daughter's character. She continued with the kind of sisterly honesty that only someone who'd known you your entire life could deliver. "Do you remember what Sarah was like as a little girl, before Mom died? She was thoughtful and grateful and always tried to help with household chores without being asked. But after the funeral, when you started overcompensating for her loss by giving her everything she wanted, she changed into someone who expected the world to revolve around her needs and feelings." Helen had observed things over the years that I'd been too close to see clearly. Every family gathering, every holiday, every celebration has become about Sarah and what Sarah wants and what Sarah needs. When's the last time she asked about your health, your happiness, your dreams? When's the last time she did something thoughtful for you without expecting something in return? I've watched you pour your entire life into making her happy, and I've watched her become increasingly demanding and less grateful with every passing year. She reminded me of specific incidents that I'd forgotten or dismissed at the time. "Remember 3 Christmases ago when you gave her that expensive jewelry set, and instead of thanking you, she complained that the earrings didn't match her new watch? Or last year, when you paid for her and Derek to take that cruise, and she called you from the ship to complain that their cabin wasn't as nice as some of the other passengers' rooms?" Helen's perspective on Derek was even more damning. I knew that boy was trouble the first time I met him. The way he looked around your house like he was appraising it for value. The way he talked about your job like it was something to be embarrassed about. The way he encouraged Sarah to see you as old-fashioned and simple-minded. He's been systematically turning your daughter against you while simultaneously using your money to fund their lifestyle. Helen had noticed things during her visits that I'd missed completely. Last time I was there, Derek made several comments about your house being dated and suggested that you should consider selling it and moving to a retirement community. He wasn't making conversation. He was planting seeds in Sarah's mind about what should happen to your assets as you get older. That boy has been planning to separate Sarah from your influence and your money from the very beginning. She offered to fly out immediately to provide support during what she correctly anticipated would be a difficult confrontation with Sarah and Derek. "You're going to need someone in your corner who can see this situation clearly and help you stay strong when Sarah starts using emotional manipulation to get you to back down. She's going to cry. She's going to apologize. She's going to promise things will be different. And she's going to make you feel guilty for setting boundaries and demanding respect. Helen also provided crucial perspective on my late wife's wishes and what she would have wanted for our daughter. Your wife would be heartbroken to see what Sarah has become, but she would be proud of you for finally standing up for yourself and teaching Sarah some hard lessons about gratitude and respect. Love isn't just giving someone everything they want. Sometimes love means holding people accountable for their behavior and helping them become better people, even when it's painful for everyone involved. Over the next few days, with Helen's encouragement and the investigators' continued research, I began to uncover the full scope of Derek's deception and manipulation that extended far beyond simple credit card fraud. James Walsh had expanded his investigation and discovered that Derek's plans for Sarah's future were even more calculated and cruel than I'd initially realized. Derek had been systematically researching ways to isolate Sarah from her support system, particularly from me, while positioning himself as her only source of emotional and eventually financial security. The job offer in Seattle wasn't just a convenient opportunity. It was part of a deliberate strategy that Derek had been planning for over 6 months. He'd specifically sought positions in cities that were far enough from our area to make regular visits impractical and expensive, effectively cutting Sarah off from any family connections that might interfere with his control over her. He'd researched the cost of flights between Seattle and our city, the time zone differences that would make regular phone contact more difficult, and even the local housing market to ensure that once they moved, it would be financially difficult for Sarah to return if their relationship didn't work out. Even more disturbing, the investigator had discovered that Derek had been subtly discouraging Sarah from maintaining friendships and relationships with anyone who might question his influence or offer her alternative perspectives on their relationship. Several of Sarah's college friends and coworkers had been gradually pushed out of her social circle through Derek's complaints that they were negative influences or that they didn't understand the sophisticated lifestyle he was trying to build with Sarah. He'd convinced her to decline invitations to gatherings where I might be present, telling her that it was important for them to establish their independence as a couple rather than being dependent on family connections for their social life. Derek had also been researching elder care laws and financial planning strategies, apparently anticipating a future where he and Sarah might need to make decisions about my care and assets as I aged. The investigator found search histories on Derek's computer that included terms like elderly parent financial management, power of attorney procedures, and nursing home costs, suggesting that he was already planning for how to manage what he saw as Sarah's inheritance. This wasn't just a gold digger looking for short-term financial gain. This was a calculated predator planning to control and exploit both Sarah and me for years to come. Perhaps most shocking of all was the discovery that Derek had been secretly documenting what he called my concerning behaviors and signs of mental decline. He'd been keeping a journal of incidents where he claimed I'd been confused, forgetful, or unreasonable, apparently building a case that could be used to question my mental competency if I ever became an obstacle to his plans. These incidents were fabricated or grossly misrepresented normal behaviors, like the time I'd asked him to repeat something he'd said because I couldn't hear him clearly over the restaurant noise, which he'd recorded as Robert showing signs of hearing loss and cognitive confusion in social settings. James also uncovered evidence that Derek had been encouraging Sarah to see my generosity and financial support as unhealthy dependence rather than loving sacrifice. He'd been systematically reframing my parenting style and our relationship in negative terms, using pop psychology language about enmeshment and codependency to make Sarah feel guilty about accepting my help while simultaneously ensuring that she continued to depend on that help financially. It was a masterful manipulation that kept the money flowing while destroying Sarah's respect and gratitude for my sacrifices. The investigators' report revealed that Derek's family was aware of his manipulative tendencies and his history of exploiting romantic relationships for financial gain. His previous girlfriend, a woman named Amanda who dated him for 2 years, had experienced a similar pattern of isolation from family and friends, financial manipulation, and emotional abuse. Amanda had eventually broken free from the relationship, but not before Derek had convinced her to lend him over $20,000 that he'd never repaid. Derek's parents had apparently hoped that marriage might settle him down and give him the motivation to develop legitimate career prospects, but they'd grown increasingly concerned about his treatment of Sarah and his continued financial irresponsibility. With Helen's support and Margaret's legal guidance, I began conducting a comprehensive audit of my financial relationship with Sarah and Derek, and what I discovered was far worse than I'd initially imagined. Over the past 5 years, since Derek had entered our lives, my financial support for Sarah had escalated from occasional help to complete subsidization of her lifestyle, and the total amount was staggering when I finally calculated everything together. The spreadsheet I created with Helen's help painted a devastating picture of financial exploitation that had been disguised as normal family support. Sarah's monthly rent, which I'd been paying for 3 years, totaled $43,200. Her car payment and insurance, which I'd been handling since she graduated college, added another $18,000 to the total. Her health insurance, credit card payments, student loan obligations that she'd somehow convinced me to assume, and various other monthly expenses brought the basic subsidy to over $75,000 per year in direct payments. But that was just the beginning of the financial drain that Sarah and Derek had created in my life. There were the emergency payments that always seemed to be needed just before major holidays or special occasions. The car repairs that somehow always cost exactly as much as Sarah happened to need for some other expense. The medical bills that weren't quite covered by insurance. The job search expenses when Sarah decided she needed a career change. The professional development courses that were essential for her advancement. The vacation deposits for trips that would help her mental health during stressful periods. Each individual request had seemed reasonable at the time, but together they represented thousands of additional dollars flowing from my accounts to Sarah's lifestyle. Helen helped me trace these patterns back through 5 years of bank records, credit card statements, and financial documents, and we discovered that my total financial support for Sarah had exceeded $250,000 during this period. That $250,000 represented my entire retirement savings, the life insurance payout from my wife's death, the equity from refinancing my house, and every penny of overtime and side work income I'd earned during the prime earning years of my career. I'd been completely financially depleted by my daughter's endless needs and demands, and I was now facing my retirement years with virtually no savings, no investments, and a mortgage that should have been paid off years ago. Even worse, Derek had been actively encouraging Sarah to see this financial support as inadequate, rather than extraordinary. According to Sarah's complaints during phone calls with friends, conversations that Helen had overheard during family gatherings, Derek regularly pointed out that other parents provided even more support for their adult children. He'd researched what wealthy families typically spent on their children's weddings, cars, and living expenses, and he'd convinced Sarah that my contributions were actually modest compared to what really generous parents provided. This constant comparison to impossible standards had left Sarah feeling like I was somehow cheap or stingy, despite the fact that I'd given her everything I had and more. The wedding expenses represented the final assault on my financial stability. The $70,000 I'd already committed to vendors would have consumed the last of my accessible savings, and Derek had been pushing for additional upgrades and expenses that would have required me to take out loans against my house. The honeymoon trip to Europe that Derek insisted was essential for starting their marriage properly would have cost another $15,000. The furniture and household items they needed to set up their new apartment would have required at least $10,000 more. By the time Derek was finished with his vision for their perfect life, I would have been financially ruined, forced to sell my house and live on Social Security alone while they enjoyed the lifestyle my life's work had provided. The cruelest irony was that none of this generosity had created the gratitude and family closeness I'd hoped for. Instead, each financial gift had seemed to increase Sarah's sense of entitlement and Derek's contempt for me. They'd begun treating my money like their right rather than my choice, and they'd started making plans for my future that prioritized their convenience over my dignity and independence. That evening, while going through some old boxes in my attic looking for financial documents Helen had requested, I discovered something that changed everything and crystallized my resolve in a way that nothing else could have. Hidden away in a box of my late wife's personal belongings was a letter she'd written to Sarah just before she died, a letter I'd never known existed and that she'd apparently intended for Sarah to receive when she became an adult. The envelope was marked, "For Sarah on her wedding day," in my wife's careful handwriting, and with trembling hands, I opened it to find words that seemed to speak directly to our current situation with prophetic clarity. My wife had written about her hopes and fears for Sarah's future, her concerns about raising a daughter without a mother's guidance, and her deep gratitude for the father she knew I would be during the difficult years ahead. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you've found someone special enough to marry, and I hope that your father has been able to walk you down the aisle and dance with you at your reception the way we always planned when you were a little girl." The letter continued with my wife's memories of our dreams. For Sarah's future, the values we'd hoped to instill in her, and the kind of woman we'd wanted her to become. "I worry sometimes that losing me so young might make you take your father's love for granted. He's going to sacrifice everything for you, Sarah, because that's the kind of man he is, and because his love for you will be amplified by his grief over losing me. But I hope you'll always remember that his generosity comes from a place of pure love, not obligation, and that the greatest gift you can give him is your gratitude, respect, and the knowledge that his sacrifices helped you become a strong, independent, grateful woman." My wife had somehow anticipated exactly the situation that had developed between Sarah and me. "Please don't let anyone convince you that your father's involvement in your life is controlling or inappropriate. He's not trying to hold you back. He's trying to launch you forward with all the love and support that both of us would have provided if I'd been able to stay. And please, my darling girl, don't ever let anyone make you feel ashamed of where you come from or embarrassed by the simple, honest life your father has built for our family." The letter went on to describe her hopes for Sarah's marriage and her expectations about how Sarah would treat me in my later years. "I hope that when your father gets older, you'll be there for him the way he was there for you during your childhood. I hope you'll include him in your family celebrations, value his wisdom and experience, and make sure he knows how much his lifetime of love and sacrifice meant to you. He's going to need you someday, Sarah, and I hope you'll be generous with your time, attention, and care the way he's been generous with his. Reading those words while sitting in my empty house, surrounded by evidence of Sarah's ingratitude and Derek's manipulation, I felt something shift inside me, from hurt and confusion to clear, cold determination. My wife had trusted me to raise Sarah into the kind of woman who would be worthy of the sacrifices I'd made, and I'd failed both of them by allowing Sarah to become entitled, ungrateful, and disrespectful. But it wasn't too late to honor my wife's memory by teaching Sarah the lessons she should have learned years ago about gratitude, consequences, and the true meaning of family loyalty. I called Helen immediately and read her the letter over the phone, and I could hear her crying as I shared my wife's words. "Robert, this is exactly what you needed to hear. Your wife would be heartbroken to see what Sarah has become, but she would want you to take action to correct this situation. You've been enabling Sarah's selfishness because you thought that was what love looked like, but real love sometimes means holding people accountable for their behavior and helping them face the consequences of their choices." Helen's words gave me the final push I needed to move from planning to action. Margaret had already prepared all the legal documents I would need to protect myself from Derek's fraud and to exercise my rights regarding the wedding contracts. The investigator had provided me with comprehensive evidence of Derek's deception and manipulation. My sister was flying in to provide moral support during what was sure to be a difficult confrontation. And now, my wife's letter had given me the moral clarity and emotional strength to do what needed to be done, not just for my own dignity and financial security, but to honor the memory of the woman who'd trusted me to raise our daughter properly. I spent that night writing my own letter to Sarah, explaining everything I'd discovered about Derek's fraud and manipulation, documenting the financial sacrifices I'd made for her over the years, and setting out the new boundaries and expectations that would govern our relationship going forward. This wasn't going to be an angry confrontation or an emotional outburst. This was going to be a calm, methodical correction of a situation that had gone on far too long and hurt too many people. The next morning, I began implementing the strategic plan that Margaret and I had developed to address both Derek's criminal behavior and the wedding situation that had spiraled completely out of control. The first step was filing a formal police report about the credit card fraud, something I'd been hesitant to do because I knew it would likely result in Derek facing serious criminal charges. But Margaret had convinced me that allowing criminal behavior to continue unchecked would only encourage Derek to escalate his exploitation, and that protecting other potential victims was more important than avoiding family drama. Detective Maria Santos at the local police department was sympathetic and professional as I explained the situation and provided documentation of the unauthorized charges Derek had made using my credit card information. She explained that identity theft and credit card fraud were serious crimes that the district attorney's office prosecuted aggressively, especially in cases like this where there was clear intent to deceive and a pattern of ongoing criminal behavior. The detective also noted that Derek's systematic approach to the fraud, using my information for multiple purchases over several months, would likely result in felony charges rather than simple misdemeanor theft. I also began the process of notifying my credit card companies and banks about the fraudulent activity, a tedious but necessary task that involved filling out affidavits, providing copies of police reports, and working with fraud prevention departments to secure my accounts and reverse the unauthorized charges. Each financial institution I contacted expressed concern about how Derek had obtained my account information and recommended additional security measures to prevent future unauthorized access. The credit card companies were particularly helpful, explaining that they would not only reverse the fraudulent charges, but would also assist with the criminal prosecution by providing detailed records of Derek's spending patterns and transaction histories. Margaret had also prepared cease and desist letters to send to Derek, formally demanding that he stop using my financial information and requiring him to make immediate restitution for the money he'd stolen. These letters served multiple legal purposes. They created an official record of our demands. They demonstrated that Derek was aware his behavior was criminal, and they established a timeline for legal action if he failed to comply with our requirements. The letters also warned Derek that any attempt to retaliate against me or to interfere with my legal rights regarding the wedding vendors would result in additional criminal charges and civil litigation. While handling the legal aspects of Derek's fraud, I also began the more emotionally difficult process of preparing to withdraw my financial support from Sarah and cancel the wedding arrangements I'd been funding. This required careful coordination with multiple vendors and service providers, each of whom needed to understand that I was the legal contract holder and paying party, not Derek or Sarah. Most of the vendors were understanding once I explained that I was dealing with fraudulent charges and unauthorized use of my credit cards, and several mentioned that they'd had concerns about Derek's attitude and behavior during previous planning meetings. The wedding venue manager, Patricia Williams, was particularly supportive when I explained the situation during a private meeting at her office. She'd noticed that Derek often made decisions and demands without consulting me, despite knowing that I was the one paying for everything, and she'd been concerned about the disrespectful way he sometimes spoke about me in front of other vendors. Patricia assured me that the venue would work with me to resolve the contract in a way that protected my financial interests while minimizing any legal complications. She also mentioned that several other vendors had commented on Derek's arrogant attitude and his tendency to make expensive changes without considering who would be responsible for paying the additional costs. I spent considerable time that week calling each vendor personally to explain the situation and begin the process of modifying or canceling contracts. The florist was disappointed but understanding, especially when I explained that Derek had been making unauthorized charges on my credit card. The photographer expressed relief, mentioning that Derek had been demanding additional services and changes that weren't included in the original contract. The caterer was professional and accommodating, though she did mention that Derek's behavior during the menu tasting had been problematic and disrespectful to her staff. Each conversation reinforced my growing understanding that Derek's true character had been apparent to others long before I'd been willing to acknowledge it myself. During my follow-up meeting with Margaret to review the progress on Derek's fraud case and the wedding contract modifications, she delivered news that completely changed my understanding of how dangerous Derek's manipulations had become, and how urgent it was for me to take decisive action to protect myself. Her investigator contacts had uncovered evidence that Derek had been researching legal strategies that could potentially be used against me, and what they'd found was both shocking and terrifying in its calculated cruelty. Derek had been consulting with an attorney who specialized in elder law and family disputes, specifically asking about procedures for obtaining guardianship or conservatorship over elderly family members who were deemed mentally incompetent or financially irresponsible. He'd been researching the legal requirements for having someone declared unable to manage their own affairs, the process for appointing a family member to take control of their finances and medical decisions, and the steps necessary to override an elderly person's wishes if they were considered to be making poor decisions. Margaret's contacts had obtained copies of Derek's research materials and consultation notes, which revealed a sophisticated understanding of how Adult Protective Services investigations worked and what kind of evidence would be needed to convince a court that I was no longer capable of making sound financial decisions. Derek had been systematically documenting what he characterized as my erratic spending on Sarah's needs, framing my generosity as evidence of mental decline and poor judgment rather than loving sacrifice. He'd been taking photos of my house to document what he called hoarding tendencies and failure to maintain basic living standards, focusing on the cluttered basement where I kept my woodworking tools and the garage where I stored seasonal decorations and household supplies. He'd been encouraging Sarah to notice and comment on my forgetfulness and confusion, then documenting her observations as evidence of cognitive decline. Even more disturbing, Derek had been researching my medical history and prescription medications, apparently looking for any conditions or treatments that could be used to support a claim that I was mentally impaired or susceptible to manipulation. The consultation notes revealed Derek's timeline for implementing this strategy. He'd planned to wait until after the wedding, when he and Sarah would presumably have moved to Seattle and established their new life together, before initiating legal proceedings to have me declared incompetent. The distance would make it difficult for me to mount an effective defense, and Sarah's testimony about my alleged mental decline would carry significant weight with a court. Once Derek had obtained legal control over my affairs, he could sell my house, access my remaining assets, and make decisions about my care that prioritized his and Sarah's financial interests over my well-being and wishes. Margaret explained that this type of elder abuse was becoming increasingly common as adult children and their spouses sought ways to access aging parents' assets before inheritance proceedings. Derek's plan is sophisticated and potentially very effective, especially since he's been laying the groundwork for months by documenting what he characterizes as evidence of your mental decline. The fact that you've been giving large amounts of money to Sarah could be presented to a court as proof that you're no longer capable of making sound financial decisions. The timeline made Derek's other behaviors more sinister and calculated than I'd previously understood. His encouragement of Sarah's financial dependence wasn't just about accessing my money in the present. It was about establishing a pattern that could later be used to justify taking complete control of my assets and decisions. His research into Seattle job opportunities wasn't just about career advancement. It was about creating physical distance that would make it difficult for me to defend myself against legal challenges to my competency. Margaret recommended immediate action to protect myself from this potential legal assault. We need to document your mental competency through medical and psychological evaluations, establish legal safeguards that would make it difficult for Derek to pursue guardianship proceedings, and create a paper trail that demonstrates you're making informed, rational decisions about your finances and your relationship with Sarah. She also suggested that we accelerate our timeline for addressing the wedding situation and Derek's fraud, since any delay would give him more time to implement his guardianship strategy and potentially more evidence to use against me in legal proceedings. With Margaret's warning about Derek's guardianship research providing new urgency to the situation, I accelerated my preparations and began implementing the more dramatic steps that would protect me from Derek's legal machinations, while sending a clear message about the consequences of their betrayal and exploitation. The first and most symbolic action I decided to take was canceling the wedding venue both because it represented the largest single expense I'd committed to and because it would demonstrate to Derek and Sarah that their plans for the future could not proceed without my cooperation and financial support. I'd been dreading this conversation with Patricia Williams at the venue, but when I called to schedule a meeting, she was immediately understanding and supportive of my decision. During our meeting at the historic mansion, where Sarah's wedding was supposed to take place, Patricia revealed that she'd been increasingly uncomfortable with Derek's behavior during the planning process and had actually been hoping I would reconsider the arrangement. She described incidents where Derek had been demanding and condescending toward her staff, where he'd made unauthorized changes to the service timeline and menu without consulting me as the paying party, and where he'd made inappropriate comments about my age and competency that had offended several of her employees. Patricia also mentioned that Derek had been pressuring her to allow additional guests beyond the contracted number, claiming that his family's social status required a larger celebration than originally planned, and that he'd been resistant to paying the additional fees that would have been required for these changes. Most concerning of all, Patricia revealed that Derek had recently approached her about modifying the payment schedule to delay final payment until after the wedding, essentially asking her to extend credit based on promises about future payment rather than the guaranteed funds I'd already provided through deposits and advance payments. When I explained the full situation, including Derek's fraudulent use of my credit card and his research into having me declared mentally incompetent, Patricia was both shocked and sympathetic. She assured me that the venue would fully cooperate with canceling the contract and would provide a complete refund of the deposits I'd paid, minus only a small administrative fee for the time and resources that had already been invested in planning Sarah's event. She also offered to provide written documentation of Derek's inappropriate behavior and unreasonable demands, which Margaret had suggested might be useful if Derek attempted to pursue any legal action against me for withdrawing my financial support. The venue cancellation was just the beginning of a systematic withdrawal from all the wedding-related contracts I'd signed and funded over the past several months. I spent the next few days contacting each vendor personally, explaining the situation and exercising my rights as the paying party to modify or cancel services. The process was easier than I'd anticipated because most of the vendors had their own concerns about Derek's behavior and were relieved to learn that they wouldn't have to continue working with someone who'd been difficult and demanding throughout the planning process. The photographer, Maria Santos, actually thanked me for canceling, explaining that Derek had been unreasonable about scheduling and had demanded additional services that weren't included in the original contract. The caterer expressed similar relief, mentioning that Derek had been rude to her staff during the menu tasting and had made last-minute changes that would have been expensive and difficult to accommodate. Even the band leader seemed pleased to be released from the contract, noting that Derek had been demanding specific songs and performance elements that weren't part of their usual wedding repertoire and would have required additional rehearsal time and equipment rentals. As I worked through this process of systematic cancellation, I began to understand how much stress and anxiety Derek's behavior had been creating for everyone involved in the wedding planning. These were professional people who prided themselves on creating beautiful, memorable events for their clients, and Derek's attitude and demands had been making their jobs unnecessarily difficult and unpleasant. By removing myself and my financial support from the equation, I was actually doing these vendors a favor by freeing them from a client who would have continued to be problematic and demanding throughout the remaining weeks leading up to the wedding. As word of the venue cancellation began to spread through the network of wedding vendors, the cascading effects of my decision became apparent, and Derek and Sarah's carefully constructed wedding plans began unraveling with remarkable speed. The vendors I hadn't yet contacted began calling me directly, some to confirm whether they should continue with their preparations, and others to express concern about payment for services that were scheduled to be delivered in just a few weeks. Each conversation gave me additional insight into Derek's behavior and confirmed that my decision to withdraw support was not only justified but long overdue, based on how he'd been treating the people who were working to create his dream wedding. The florist, Elena Rodriguez, called me in a panic after hearing from the venue that the wedding had been canceled, worried that the elaborate floral arrangements she'd been designing for weeks would now be wasted time and effort. When I explained the situation and assured her that she would be paid for any work already completed, but that I was canceling the remaining services, Elena's relief was obvious and immediate. She confided that Derek had been making her job increasingly difficult by demanding changes to the floral designs that weren't consistent with the budget I'd approved, and by criticizing her suggestions in ways that she found disrespectful and unprofessional. She mentioned specific incidents where Derek had dismissed her expertise and experience, treating her like a servant rather than a skilled professional whose advice about flowers and arrangements might actually be valuable to the overall success of the wedding. The wedding photographer's response was similar when I called to cancel his services and arrange final payment for the engagement photos he'd already taken. Michael Chen expressed relief that he wouldn't have to work with Derek on the wedding day, explaining that Derek had been demanding and controlling during the engagement photo session in ways that had made both Sarah and the photographer uncomfortable. Michael described how Derek had insisted on specific poses and locations that weren't flattering to Sarah or appropriate for the style of photography they'd discussed, and how he'd been critical and dismissive when Michael had tried to offer professional suggestions based on years of experience photographing weddings and couples. The caterer's reaction was perhaps the most telling when I called to discuss canceling the reception dinner and arranging final payment for the menu planning and preparation work she'd already completed. Janet Morrison revealed that Derek had been increasingly difficult to work with as the wedding date approached, making demands about menu modifications and service style that weren't consistent with the contract I'd signed or the budget I'd approved. She described a recent meeting where Derek had been condescending and rude to her staff, treating the servers and kitchen workers like they were incompetent, despite their years of experience and professional training. Janet also mentioned that Derek had been pressuring her to provide additional services, like extended bar service and late-night snacks, without being willing to pay the additional costs that would have been required for these extras. As I worked through these cancellation conversations, a clear pattern emerged that confirmed everything the private investigator and Margaret had discovered about Derek's character and behavior. He consistently treated service providers and working people with disrespect and condescension. He made demands that exceeded agreed-upon budgets and contracts, and he seemed to believe that other people should accommodate his wishes, regardless of the practical or financial implications. The vendors were universally relieved to be free from working with Derek, even though it meant losing the income they would have earned from providing wedding services. Several of them mentioned that they'd been dreading the actual wedding day because Derek's behavior during the planning process had been so problematic that they expected him to be even more difficult and demanding when the pressure and stakes were higher. By the end of the week, Sarah and Derek were facing the reality that their elaborate wedding celebration had been completely dismantled, and that rebooking comparable services with just a few weeks' notice would be virtually impossible, even if they had the financial resources to pay for everything themselves. The venues, caterers, photographers, and other service providers who could accommodate such short notice were either much more expensive than what I'd been paying or significantly lower quality than the level of service I'd arranged for their special day. The situation escalated dramatically when Detective Santos called to inform me that Derek had been arrested on multiple felony charges related to the credit card fraud investigation, and that the scope of his criminal activity was far broader and more sophisticated than even I had realized during my initial discovery of the unauthorized charges on my accounts. The detective explained that once they'd begun investigating Derek's financial activities, they'd uncovered evidence of similar fraud schemes involving other victims, suggesting that identity theft and financial manipulation were ongoing criminal enterprises for Derek rather than isolated incidents related to his relationship with Sarah. Derek had apparently been operating multiple credit accounts, using false or stolen identity information, and my case was just one part of a larger pattern of financial crimes that had been occurring over several years. The detective's investigation had revealed that Derek had been systematically targeting older individuals who had family connections that provided access to personal and financial information, particularly parents and relatives of romantic partners who might be trusting enough to share sensitive data for legitimate purposes. Derek's method was to gradually gain access to credit card numbers, social security information, and bank account details through seemingly innocent requests or by observing financial documents in shared living spaces, then to use this information to make unauthorized purchases that could be disguised among legitimate expenses or charged to accounts that weren't monitored closely by the victims. The charges against Derek included multiple counts of identity theft, credit card fraud, elder financial abuse, and organized financial crimes, with potential sentences ranging from several years to over a decade in state prison, depending on the total amount of money involved and the number of victims who could be identified. Detective Santos explained that Derek's arrest had been coordinated with investigators in 2 other states where similar crimes had been reported, and that federal authorities were also interested in the case because Derek's activities appeared to cross state lines and involve sophisticated planning that elevated the crimes beyond simple local fraud. The most shocking revelation came when Detective Santos explained that Derek had been planning to expand his criminal activities after the wedding by using his marriage to Sarah as a way to gain legal access to my financial accounts and personal information. The investigators' analysis of Derek's computer and personal documents revealed detailed plans for obtaining power of attorney over my financial affairs, accessing my bank accounts and investment accounts, and systematically draining my assets while using his position as Sarah's husband to justify his actions as legitimate family financial management. Derek had researched exactly how much money he could steal before triggering automatic fraud alerts from banks and credit card companies, and he'd developed sophisticated strategies for moving money between accounts and making purchases that would be difficult to trace or reverse. The detective also revealed that Derek had been documenting my personal habits, daily routines, and security practices, apparently planning to use this information to access my accounts and personal information even more effectively after the wedding, when he would presumably have greater access to my home and personal documents. When Detective Santos asked if I wanted to press charges and pursue full prosecution, I didn't hesitate to say yes, not only because Derek had stolen from me and planned to continue stealing, but because I realized that allowing him to escape consequences would put other potential victims at risk of experiencing the same financial and emotional devastation that Sarah and I had endured. The detective assured me that the evidence against Derek was overwhelming and that conviction on multiple felony charges was virtually certain, which meant that Derek would likely be facing significant prison time that would prevent him from continuing his criminal activities or manipulating other families the way he'd manipulated mine. The arrest also meant that Derek's secret job offer in Seattle was now irrelevant, since he would be spending the next several years in state prison rather than starting a new career and life across the country with Sarah as his unwitting accomplice and enabler. 2 days after Derek's arrest made the local news, Sarah arrived at my house accompanied by Derek's parents, Charles and Eleanor Whitman, in what was clearly intended to be an intimidation tactic designed to pressure me into dropping the criminal charges and restoring financial support for a wedding that was now completely impossible given Derek's legal situation. I had been expecting some kind of confrontation ever since Detective Santos had told me about the arrest, but I hadn't anticipated that Derek's family would attempt to involve themselves in what was essentially a criminal matter that was now in the hands of law enforcement and the district attorney's office. Helen had flown in from Arizona the day before, anticipating that Sarah would eventually attempt some kind of emotional manipulation or dramatic confrontation, and her presence in my living room provided the moral support and clear-headed perspective I needed to handle what turned out to be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. Charles Whitman began the conversation by introducing himself and his wife with the kind of formal arrogance that immediately reminded me of Derek's entitled attitude and condescending manner of speaking to people he considered beneath his social status. He explained that Derek was their only son, that the charges against him were obviously some kind of misunderstanding or overreaction on my part, and that they were prepared to make financial restitution for any legitimate grievances I might have in exchange for my cooperation in resolving the situation quietly and privately. Eleanor Whitman's approach was more subtle but equally insulting, expressing sympathy for what she characterized as my confusion about Derek's intentions, and suggesting that elderly people sometimes misinterpret normal business arrangements and family financial planning as something more sinister than they actually are. She spoke to me like I was a child or someone with limited mental capacity, using the kind of patronizing tone that made it clear she viewed me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a person deserving of respect and consideration. Sarah's contribution to this confrontation was perhaps the most heartbreaking part of the entire experience, because it revealed just how completely Derek had succeeded in manipulating her perceptions and turning her against me. She stood beside Derek's parents like she was part of their family rather than mine, and when she spoke, it was to defend Derek's character and minimize the seriousness of his criminal behavior rather than to express any concern for how I'd been victimized and betrayed by someone I'd welcomed into our family. Sarah actually had the audacity to suggest that Derek's use of my credit card information was a simple misunderstanding, that he'd assumed he had permission to make those purchases because of how generous I'd been with wedding expenses, and that involving the police was an extreme overreaction that was causing unnecessary embarrassment and hardship for everyone involved. She characterized Derek's systematic theft and fraud as poor communication and different expectations about family financial arrangements, completely ignoring the calculated and deceptive nature of his criminal behavior. When Charles Whitman began questioning my mental competency and suggesting that my age and grief over my wife's death had affected my judgment about family relationships and financial decisions, Helen intervened with a kind of direct confrontation that only someone who'd known our family for decades could deliver effectively. She presented them with copies of the investigator's report documenting Derek's criminal history, his manipulation strategies, and his plans to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could gain control of my assets. She also shared excerpts from my wife's letter to Sarah, contrasting the values and character my wife had hoped to instill in our daughter with the entitled, ungrateful behavior Sarah was currently demonstrating. The confrontation reached its climax when I presented Derek's parents with documented evidence of their son's fraud, including bank records, credit card statements, and police reports that proved the scope and intentional nature of his criminal activities. Charles Whitman's arrogant confidence began to crumble as he realized that Derek had been lying to them about his financial situation, his relationship with Sarah, and his reasons for needing their help with legal expenses. Eleanor Whitman became visibly upset when she learned about Derek's research into elder abuse laws and his plans to manipulate legal proceedings to gain control of my financial affairs. Apparently realizing for the first time that their son was capable of sophisticated criminal planning and manipulation that extended far beyond simple poor judgment or financial desperation. The confrontation in my living room reached its emotional peak when Sarah, clearly frustrated by her inability to manipulate me into dropping the charges against Derek and restoring financial support for their now impossible wedding, delivered an ultimatum that revealed the full extent of how completely she'd been turned against me by Derek's systematic manipulation and her own sense of entitlement. With Derek's parents flanking her like bodyguards and Helen sitting beside me as a witness to this family crisis, Sarah looked me directly in the eyes and spoke words that I knew would change our relationship forever, regardless of what happened in the months and years to come. Dad, you need to decide right now what's more important to you, your pride and your need to punish Derek for what you think he's done, or having a relationship with your daughter and any future grandchildren you might hope to meet someday. Her voice was cold and calculating, without any trace of the warmth or affection that had once characterized our conversations, and I realized that this was probably how she'd been speaking about me in private for months or even years. Sarah continued with her ultimatum, apparently believing that the threat of losing access to her and her future family would be devastating enough to make me abandon my principles and my right to seek justice for Derek's crimes. If you don't drop these ridiculous charges against Derek and restore the wedding funding you promised, then you're making a choice to prioritize your own petty grievances over our relationship. I won't be able to trust you or feel safe around someone who would destroy my happiness and my future over money and wounded pride. The cruelty and manipulation in her words were breathtaking. But what shocked me even more was the realization that Sarah genuinely seemed to believe that she was the victim in this situation, that my refusal to continue enabling her lifestyle and covering up for Derek's crimes was somehow an act of betrayal rather than a long overdue assertion of boundaries and self-respect. Sarah had become so accustomed to my unconditional financial support and emotional availability that she couldn't comprehend why I wouldn't sacrifice my dignity, my financial security, and my moral principles to ensure her continued comfort and happiness. Helen's response to Sarah's ultimatum was immediate and uncompromising, delivered with the authority of someone who'd watched our family dynamics deteriorate over several years and had finally reached her limit of tolerance for Sarah's entitled behavior. Sarah, do you hear yourself right now? You're threatening to cut your father out of your life unless he continues to fund your wedding to a man who stole from him and planned to destroy his independence and dignity. You're demanding that he ignore criminal behavior and financial abuse because holding Derek accountable might inconvenience your social plans. Helen continued, with an emotional intensity that seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including me. Your father has given you everything he has, literally everything, for your entire adult life. He's sacrificed his retirement security, his social life, his personal happiness, and his financial future to make sure you could have whatever you wanted. And your response to learning that your boyfriend has been systematically stealing from him is to demand that he ignore it and keep paying for your lifestyle. The confrontation reached its climax when I responded to Sarah's ultimatum with a calmness and clarity that surprised even me, born from the emotional clarity that my wife's letter had provided, and the moral certainty that came from finally understanding the true nature of what had been happening in my relationship with Sarah. I looked at my daughter, this young woman I'd raised and loved and sacrificed everything for, and I spoke words that I knew would define our relationship for whatever time we had remaining together. Sarah, you're absolutely right that I have a choice to make, but it's not the choice you think it is. My choice is between enabling your continued disrespect and ingratitude by funding a lifestyle you haven't earned and don't appreciate, or finally teaching you the lessons about consequences and accountability that I should have taught you years ago. I continued with a firmness that felt foreign but necessary, drawing on strength I didn't know I possessed. Derek stole from me, lied to both of us, and planned to destroy my independence and dignity so he could control our family's assets and decisions. The fact that you're defending him, instead of being horrified by his behavior, tells me everything I need to know about how successful he's been at turning you against me and destroying your sense of gratitude and family loyalty. On what should have been Sarah's wedding day, I woke up in my quiet house, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief that surprised me with its intensity and clarity. Instead of spending the morning getting dressed for a celebration at the elegant venue I'd paid for, instead of walking my daughter down the aisle in the beautiful ceremony I'd funded, I was drinking coffee in my kitchen while reading news reports about Derek's arraignment on multiple felony charges and the ongoing investigation into his financial crimes that had affected several families in our area. Helen had stayed for an extra week to provide support during what we'd both anticipated might be a difficult emotional period, but instead of feeling devastated or regretful about my decisions, I found myself experiencing something closer to liberation from a situation that had been draining my resources, my energy, and my self-respect for far too long. The morning brought phone calls from several of the wedding vendors I'd worked with, checking to make sure I was handling the situation well and expressing their continued support for my decision to withdraw from the financial arrangements that had been making their professional lives difficult and stressful. Patricia, from the wedding venue, called to let me know that she'd heard about Derek's arrest in the local news and to express her relief that she wouldn't have to deal with his demanding and disrespectful behavior on what would have been one of the busiest and most stressful days of her professional calendar. She mentioned that several other vendors had contacted her to share similar sentiments, and that the wedding industry professionals in our area were relieved to be free from Derek's unreasonable expectations and condescending attitude. Around noon, Helen and I decided to drive past Sarah's apartment building, not to interfere or create drama, but simply to satisfy our curiosity about how she and Derek's family were handling the collapse of their elaborate wedding plans and the reality of his criminal charges. What we observed was a small, hastily organized gathering in the apartment complex's courtyard, with perhaps 15 or 20 people attempting to create some kind of wedding celebration using folding chairs, grocery store flowers, and decorations that looked like they'd been purchased at a discount party supply store. Sarah was wearing what appeared to be a simple white dress rather than the elaborate designer gown I'd paid $8,000 for, and the entire scene had an air of desperation and improvisation that was both sad and somehow fitting, given the circumstances that had led to this point. Derek was notably absent from this makeshift ceremony, presumably because he was in jail awaiting trial or meeting with attorneys about his legal situation, which meant that Sarah was essentially hosting a wedding reception without a groom or an actual wedding to celebrate. The handful of guests appeared uncomfortable and confused, clearly aware that this was not the elegant celebration they'd been expecting to attend, and several people seemed to be leaving early rather than participating in what had become an embarrassment for everyone involved. Charles and Eleanor Whitman were present but looked mortified by the entire situation, presumably because their social circle was now aware that their son had been arrested on serious criminal charges, and that the wedding they'd been anticipating had collapsed due to fraud and family conflict. From our vantage point across the street, Helen and I could see that this gathering was less a celebration than a desperate attempt to salvage some dignity from a situation that had spiraled completely out of control due to Derek's criminal behavior and Sarah's refusal to acknowledge the seriousness of what had happened to our family. The contrast between this sad improvised gathering and the elegant celebration I'd been funding was stark and somehow poetic in its demonstration of the consequences that naturally follow from ingratitude, criminal behavior, and the destruction of family relationships. Sarah had chosen to defend Derek's criminal behavior rather than acknowledge my sacrifices and express gratitude for my generosity, and the result was exactly what anyone might have predicted. Social embarrassment, financial hardship, and the kind of makeshift celebration that reflected the true value of relationships built on manipulation and exploitation, rather than love and mutual respect. 6 months after Derek's arrest and the collapse of Sarah's wedding plans, the consequences of their choices had created exactly the kind of learning experience that my wife had hoped Sarah would never need, but that had become inevitable, given the path she'd chosen with Derek's influence and manipulation. Derek had been sentenced to 4 years in state prison after pleading guilty to multiple felony charges including identity theft, elder financial abuse, and organized fraud, with the judge noting that his systematic targeting of older victims and his sophisticated planning demonstrated a level of criminal intent that warranted significant incarceration to protect other potential victims from similar schemes. The restitution order required Derek to repay not only the money he'd stolen from me, but also funds he'd fraudulently obtained from 3 other victims in our state and 2 families in neighboring states, bringing his total financial obligations to over $200,000 that he would be paying off for decades even after his release from prison. Sarah's reaction to Derek's sentencing had been a mixture of denial, anger, and gradually dawning recognition that the man she'd planned to marry was not who she'd believed him to be, though this realization came slowly and was accompanied by continued resentment toward me for what she still characterized as overreacting to Derek's mistakes rather than supporting her through a difficult time. The relationship between Derek and Sarah had deteriorated rapidly once the full extent of his criminal behavior became public knowledge and his family distanced themselves from the legal and social consequences of his actions, leaving Sarah to face the embarrassment and financial reality of her situation without the support system she'd been counting on for her future security and social status. Derek's parents had quietly settled the civil lawsuit I'd filed against their son by paying the full restitution amount, rather than allowing the case to proceed through lengthy court proceedings that would have continued to generate negative publicity for their family name and social standing in the community. Charles and Eleanor Whitman had also issued a formal written apology for their son's behavior and their own initial attempts to minimize the seriousness of his crimes, acknowledging that they'd failed to recognize the extent of Derek's manipulative and criminal tendencies, despite warning signs that had been apparent for several years before he'd met Sarah. The financial impact of Derek's crimes and the collapsed wedding had forced Sarah to confront the reality of independent adult living for the first time in her life, since my withdrawal of financial support meant that she was suddenly responsible for her own rent, car payments, insurance, credit card bills, and all the other expenses I'd been covering without her full awareness or appreciation. The transition had been difficult and sometimes desperate, with Sarah having to take a second part-time job to cover basic living expenses and having to move from her expensive downtown apartment to a much smaller and more affordable place in a less desirable neighborhood that reflected her actual earning capacity rather than the artificially inflated lifestyle my subsidies had been supporting. Sarah had also been forced to sell the car I'd been making payments on and to purchase a much older and less reliable vehicle that she could afford on her own, a change that had been particularly difficult for her because it represented a visible symbol of the reduced circumstances that resulted from the collapse of her relationship with Derek and the end of my financial enabling of her dependent lifestyle. The social consequences had been equally challenging for Sarah, as news of Derek's criminal behavior spread through their social circle and the community, creating embarrassment and isolation that made it difficult for her to maintain the friendships and social connections that had been built around the affluent lifestyle I'd been funding rather than on genuine mutual interests and shared values. Several of Sarah's friends had distanced themselves from her once they learned about Derek's arrest and the family drama surrounding the canceled wedding, apparently preferring to avoid association with what had become a source of gossip and speculation rather than offering support during a difficult period that revealed the superficial nature of relationships built around social status, rather than genuine caring and loyalty. The employment situation had also become more challenging for Sarah as potential employers became aware of her association with Derek's criminal activities through background checks and local news coverage, creating additional pressure for her to demonstrate independence and responsibility in ways she'd never been required to do when my financial support had insulated her from the normal consequences of adult decision-making and relationship choices. 2 months ago, almost 8 months after that devastating phone call about the wedding seating arrangements that had started this entire journey of discovery and consequences, Sarah reached out to me through Helen with a request for a conversation that represented the first acknowledgement she'd made that her perspective on our family situation might have been influenced by Derek's manipulation and her own sense of entitlement that had developed over years of my unconditional financial support. Helen had been maintaining limited contact with Sarah throughout the aftermath of Derek's imprisonment and the collapse of her previous lifestyle, providing occasional updates about Sarah's struggles with independent living and her gradually growing understanding of how completely she'd been manipulated by Derek's systematic campaign to turn her against me while exploiting both of our financial resources for his own benefit. Sarah's message, delivered through Helen because she was apparently too ashamed or proud to contact me directly, included an acknowledgement that Derek had lied to her about many things, including his financial situation, his family's acceptance of their relationship, his job prospects, and most importantly, his attitudes toward me and his plans for isolating her from family connections that might have interfered with his control over her decisions and resources. She had finally begun to understand that Derek's research into guardianship laws and elder abuse procedures represented a calculated plan to destroy my independence and dignity while gaining legal control over assets that represented my entire life's work and retirement security, and that his success would have left both Sarah and me completely vulnerable to his continued manipulation and exploitation. The conversation we eventually had, with Helen present as a mediator and witness, was unlike any interaction Sarah and I had shared in years, because it was the first time she approached me without expecting something or demanding that I solve some problem she'd created through poor judgment or financial irresponsibility. For the first time since she'd become an adult, Sarah asked about my health, my happiness, my plans for the future, and my feelings about the damage that had been done to our relationship through years of one-sided sacrifice that had been met with increasing entitlement rather than growing gratitude and independence. Sarah's apology was comprehensive and seemed genuine, covering not only her defense of Derek's criminal behavior and her cruel ultimatum about choosing between my dignity and our relationship, but also her years of taking my generosity for granted and treating my sacrifices as obligations rather than gifts motivated by love and hope for her success and happiness. She acknowledged that Derek had been systematically encouraging her to see my involvement in her life as controlling and inappropriate rather than supportive and loving, and that his influence had made her blind to the extent of my sacrifices and the depth of my commitment to her well-being and future security. Most importantly, Sarah expressed understanding that rebuilding our relationship would require her to demonstrate through consistent actions over time that she had genuinely learned from this experience and developed the kind of gratitude, independence, and family loyalty that my wife had hoped to see in her character as she matured into adulthood. I listened to Sarah's apology and her expressions of regret with a mixture of relief and cautious optimism, but I also made it clear that our relationship going forward would need to be fundamentally different from the enabling dynamic that had characterized our interactions since her college years and had made her vulnerable to Derek's manipulation in the first place. I explained that while I was willing to work toward rebuilding our connection as father and daughter, I would never again provide the kind of comprehensive financial support that had replaced her natural motivation to develop independence, career skills, and adult responsibility for the consequences of her choices and relationship decisions. The boundaries I established included my expectation that Sarah would demonstrate financial independence and responsible decision-making before I would consider any future assistance, that she would treat me with the kind of respect and gratitude that should characterize adult family relationships, and that she would prioritize our family connection over any romantic relationship that threatened to undermine her values or exploit our family's resources. I also shared my late wife's letter with Sarah, allowing her to understand her mother's hopes for her character development and her expectations about how Sarah would treat me in my later years, and I watched my daughter cry as she realized how far she had strayed from the woman her mother had hoped she would become and the daughter she had been raised to be before Derek's influence had corrupted her perspective on family, loyalty, and personal responsibility. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.